Discover Help presents Stress-Free Living with Ray Samich and Mr. Stress-Free, Ratanjit S. Sandhi. This audio program is an unscripted and unrehearsed conversation between Ray and Ratanjit. It is shared with you in hope of adding value to your life. We encourage you to listen to this program in its entirety to receive the full impact of its message. Sit back, relax, open your heart, mind, and soul to this edition of Stress-Free Living.
Welcome to Stress-Free Living. I'm Ray Samich, and I would like to introduce everyone to my co-host for so many years and my dear friend and colleague, Ratanjit Sandhi. Ratanjit, how are you this fine day?
Wonderful, Ray. How are you?
Excellent, thank you. And we are both excited to have a very special co-host with us here today. And this gentleman has been with us before and has done such an amazing job of communicating his specialty area of organizational behavior. He is actually a professor at Baldwin-Wallace College in Cleveland, Ohio. And he has spoken in front of thousands and thousands of people. And I understand even one time for 12 hours continuously, he has done a presentation. So we won't tax him that hard or have that large an audience here on our Zoom call, but probably in totality with radio and internet and everybody, we have more than 12,000 people. So we welcome him no matter, even if he was just speaking to a couple of close friends. We welcome a professor here from Baldwin-Wallace, Padam. Padam, thank you so very much for joining us again here today.
Thank you so much. And the pleasure is equally on this side of the fence. Thank you.
And we mentioned the Zoom audience. We welcome people to be part of that unique club that we have, that we meet with here, and that allows us to see your face and you see ours. And we can also communicate with you during the breaks. So as we go to commercial on radio, we're able to interact with you and get your questions and comments. And then afterwards, we kind of have our unique session, post-show session, where we can talk through what we have just talked about for the hour before that. But whether you're catching us that way or on radio or on YouTube on our special channel, which is Stress-Free Living Radio after the show, we welcome you any which way, anytime that you're being a part of Stress-Free Living. Let's talk today about what is really an interesting topic, Ratanjit and Padam, because we talk so much about ego. We talk so much about how we have defense mechanisms when we're insecure and our ego shines. And as part of that, I think we are also exhibiting our selfishness, because as we become more center focused and thinking only about us, then our selfishness takes over. I was intrigued to discover in a previous show from Padam that there's kind of 4 stages of that we sometimes do it knowingly, unknowingly, all those different things. So let's start with kind of a definition of what those 4 stages are that we evolve through. Padam, would you share that with us to start?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you so much for the opportunity. So if we look at selfishness as a phenomenon, the first stage of it would be where if somebody is unconscious and selfish, implying that they have no consciousness of the fact that they're selfish. They're purely looking after their own needs and priorities and doing so almost in an automatic fashion without any awareness of their selfishness. Gradually, as they evolve in their consciousness, perhaps as a result of life experiences, perhaps as a result of feedback that others might provide, they become more conscious of their selfishness. And now they have gravitated to the second stage where they're conscious of their selfishness. So it's not that they're unconsciously selfish. They are embarrassed about it. They probably want to even change it. They're conscious, but then they're still a victim of their own selfishness, so to speak, and they continue to be selfish, but with some degree of awareness now. As a higher level of consciousness sets in, they develop an altruism, perhaps as a reaction to the selfishness. So they say, well, once you become conscious of your selfishness, then you want to do something about it. You want to evolve and progress up make some progress up the evolutionary scale of consciousness. So they practice a kind of conscious altruism. So they have to stop themselves at every stage and perhaps rewire themselves consciously in certain situations to respond differently. So they become consciously altruistic. So they have to be, they have to hold their selfishness in check by being very intentional about their altruism. So it's a kind of conscious altruism. And the next stage, should they move up this ladder of progression, would be unconscious altruism, where it's not that they're being conscious of the need to be altruistic, but it just becomes an expression of a way of being, to be unconscious and altruistic. So that's where it has moved to a level of real altruism, because they have graduated beyond having to do this consciously. And they have also, it's become so automatic to them now. And it's a spontaneous expression of who they are, as opposed to it having to be the result of strategic calculation. So these would be the 4 stages. You start with unconscious selfishness, then you move to conscious selfishness, you then gravitate towards conscious altruism, and eventually, towards unconscious altruism.
So Ratanjit, I want to ask you, because so many times we have the accepted, educated concepts and views on things, and certainly our professor has that, and these were determined after studies, after watching people, after monitoring it. Do you agree that people move through those kind of stages? Do you think that you agree with his assessment on that, or is there another way of looking at that progression? Can you become from totally being overwhelmed with your selfishness, so that is just the way you are? Can you move from that to being truly altruistic, and that becomes who you are? Is that even possible to move through those stages?
See, to become unconscious, not even aware that you are unselfish, you have goodness in your heart, you have to literally kill yourself. Means not commit suicide, but let you get out of the way. Means we have talked about 3 aspects of, or 3 entities in us, or 3 ways to look at us in our human experience. One is the human body, and other is our intellectual brain, and third is the power which gives us life, the enlivening power. When that enlivening power gets out of this human experience, human body, we have a dead body. Our brain is still there, and there's no activity there. So we don't realize that all our alive or being alive is because of that power. So when I say dying while you are living, means once your brain is being operated by the power within you, then you have automatically the phenomena of unconscious altruism. And there is no other way. You can read all the books, you can try everything to be in that stage. That is not the stage where you graduate to. That is the stage that once you realize who you truly are and begin to live in that ultimate stage of our consciousness is controlled, our brain is controlled by the power within us. That is the only point when you become unconsciously altruistic.
So that third level, maybe you can still achieve that. You can evolve maybe through the first 3 stages by using our body and our mind, because we're trying to be altruistic. We make that effort, but our mind still gets in the way. We still know, well, I can do this, but it's still probably going to help me. And I'm better off giving money to this group than that group, or giving time to this group or that one, because this one will make me a little bit more notable, or this one is connected with a personal touch because my grandchild has this condition or whatever it is. As long as the brain is involved in it, it's not pure. It's not true altruism, right?
Yes. Well, brain is not, brain is controlled by the human body, then you are not.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if the
Okay.
brain is controlled by the power within us. See now, Ray, there are moments in our life when we unknowingly practice that unconscious altruism.
Mm-hmm.
There are moments. And then later on, after that act has happened through us, we go ahead and take credit for it.
Well, our brain steps in then at that point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Our brain
Or-
says, I can let everybody know I was a hero, or I
Yeah.
did this good thing, right? Yeah.
And
So let's go back to that very first stage. Param, do you think that most of us live our life at that first level? I mean, and you're seeing an evolution. All of us here have been on this earth for a number of decades. We don't have any youngsters on our Zoom call today, but I personally think that I've seen more selfishness as we have evolved over my lifetime. I just, maybe I'm wrong, but I just have a gut feeling that the technology and the world around us is actually creating more selfish people or more selfish tendencies amongst people. Do you have any thought on that? Do most of us just live in that purely selfish realm, our whole life?
I think I referred to this in a previous show that there are theorists and social philosophers who believe that man is inherently selfish, and there are others who believe that man is not inherently selfish, that human beings are thrown to a natural sense of altruism, cooperation, unselfishness. So I tend to belong to the second camp. So I don't necessarily believe that we are inherently selfish. I think, unfortunately, the way in which institutions are often designed and society creates rules and processes that tap into the selfish side of us, that create zero-sum games where only by depriving you of something will I tend to prosper. So I think there are social and economic arrangements that are based in a selfish, in a view of human nature as inherently selfish. And that's unfortunate because that paradigm then creates more opportunities for selfishness. And I would say that if you really look at it, it's almost like the red car phenomenon, right? People say that if I ask you how many red cars did you encounter on your way to the studio today, you probably would have no recollection and you're not able to say how many. But if you become conscious of it, all of a sudden red cars appear everywhere around you. I think it's also a matter of selective perception. So if you have a belief that, these are selfish times and people are only protecting their own interests, you will see more instances of it. Whereas if you convince yourself of the opposite view, that altruism is on the rise and there are many manifestations of it, and altruism at its best is, and here's the paradox we talked about once, that it's the only kind of altruism that's real is invisible altruism. So if it is by definition invisible in order to be authentic, then all those instances that you're not seeing are the only times altruism really is there. As I said, there are countless acts. In fact, I once did a dissertation on the architecture of human greatness. So the premise of the study was that human beings engage in self-transcendental behaviors, that are all-encompassing, where they rise above their narrow selfish interests more often than they would admit to. And in fact, so I interviewed people about, tell me about a moment in your life when you were a great human being in your own life. As you would well imagine, that very question elicited so many examples of altruistic behavior. And the other condition was, this is a very private moment of altruism or greatness which you have not shared with anybody. You've never told anybody this, or it hasn't been the object of much public attention at all. And I was able to hear so many examples of amazingly magnanimous things that people have done that they have never shared with anybody. So I would say that those are the private moments of silent altruism that you can truly trust.
So thank you. You gave me kind of two different ways that we can proceed on this. Ratanjit, I want to ask you, the first part is how we were created, how we were wired, as you would use that term. Do you agree that we are wired? Which group are you in? Do you think that we are wired to be altruistic, or are we wired to be selfish by design when we were created? Which way do you think we are?
See, ultimately, Ray, we find ourselves when we are not aware of what is good for me syndrome, what is in it me syndrome, or I'm not looking for benefiting myself. I'm a kind of a neutral ground. In that moment, your internal conscious knows that you are interconnected with everyone. And in that knowledge, subconscious knowledge, we tend to feel others' pains. That is, your empathy allows you to feel others' pain. And then you become compassionate. Compassion means not only you feel others' pains, but you have activity tied to doing something towards that. So under those circumstances, your body syndrome, your body control kind of lowers down, and your control of the divine power present in you enhances. So it's not that you, and I talked about initially, completely dying means if you want to remain in that altruism 100% of the time, that is the stage I was talking to. But then I mentioned that there are instances we end up doing so many good things without trying. And we gave example the other time when you are in a crowd and somebody in front of you falls down and you automatically goes to grab him or grab her. So that is an instinct within us to do that. And when we feel somebody hungry, we feel that pain. We want to do something. And so all these things are natural because ultimately we are all one. And our subconscious knows that. And basically, based on that, we are all altruistic, whether we like it or not.
Okay. So because of your examples with our instinct and what we're prone to do in our subconscious, that kind of relates. You're definitely in the tribe that says we're born altruistic, and so you both shared that same comment. So if that's how we are born, our mind then is taking over and causing us to be selfish, causing us to think about ourselves and putting away and putting aside the way that we were designed to be. It sounds to me like the influence of how we're growing up and what we watch on TV and what our friends say and all those factors are really the points that are making us think about ourselves as opposed to thinking about others. You would agree with that, right? That it's all because of what the mind's interpretation is of how we should be acting.
Well, we are systematically taught that as a small adult. This is yours. And then we also are taught that doing good things is good for you and is being a good person. So that is how we develop the egoistic feeling within us. And we are taught to become somebody. You have to be first in your class. That means the other person has to be second. So somehow or other, you are not going to share your information with your classmates so that you have an advantage. So we are systematically taught to be selfish. And then we work for a corporations. We say we want to kill our competition. We don't have cooperative instinct in our thinking, in our design, in our strategy. So our society is going in the other direction. And that is why, Ray, our happiness is minimized, or happiness is destroyed, or our stress comes into us. To remove the stress from us, if we practice what we are designed to be, we will minimize the stress.
Before we take a quick break here, I think that the people that are in that first stage, that operate that first stage, I don't know if they really even feel the stress, because if they are totally in that mode where they don't even have a conscious awareness of how they should act, and they're not even trying to improve or change or in some way be altruistic. I think, sadly, I don't think that is the majority. I think it's an actual very, very small minority of people that are in that group. But I think we probably all know some people who you can't even explain, you can't even have a conversation with them, because they are just so overwhelmed with their own actions and with their own benefits and their own goodness and their own ego. And, I'm not saying we give up on those people, because ultimately they're not happy, but it's really tough to teach people to have some awareness of consciousness if they are just prone not to. But I think most of us are in that second stage. That's what I'm kind of getting to. I really think most of us understand we still tend to be selfish, but we are trying not to be. So when we come back, we're going to especially focus on that second stage of selfishness, when we become aware of how we should act, but for whatever reasons, we still are prone to not really acting the way that we're wired to act, if that's truly the way that we are born. This is Stress-Free Living, and it's a great topic to reduce and try to reduce our stress. So we're going to continue this. Please stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment. Okay, we have 90 seconds. If anybody would like to give a quick comment or ask a question here during the break that we can ask during the show, you're welcome to do that now. We love hearing from you.
So Ray, Steve Marsh,
Yes.
Real quickly. When I was in high school, we read Lord of the Flies. If you remember Lord of the Flies, when they were in a situation, instead of being altruistic, how can we make the group succeed? They end up going to the lowest common denominator, right? They kill Piggy, whatever. And I remember writing a paper saying, gee, that's not how it would be. People would actually come to the fore and work. And I thought it was very unrealistic. Now, what I've seen in America is something that I think in some way duplicates Lord of the Flies, where whether it's white supremacists or a group not political, instead of coming together saying, how can we make the world better? It's what you said in the opening, where people are at each other. So then the question is, are we born altruistic, or are we born to worry about ourselves, which goes back to what Ratanjit just said. Sorry, it's sort of complicated.
No, you're right. Yeah, that was a hard book to read, but as you get older, you realize, unfortunately, there was some really wise, thoughtful ideas that were in that book.
I'd like Paramji to make a comment on the happiness index tied to these conditions.
Level of happiness, they go with the level of selfishness?
Yeah.
Okay, we can do that.
Is there any research or any theories or anything like that?
Okay. Do you want to do that before we zoom in on the second level?
Yeah.
Okay, we can do that.
Or we can do that after we zoom in on the second level as part of that discussion.
Okay.
We are back on Stress-Free Living, enjoying some great conversations off the air with our Zoom audience. And once again, we welcome you to be a part of that. If you'd like to be, let us know, and we'll be happy to have you included in our Zoom call every week. Ratanjit, and our special guest, professor from Baldwin Wallace College, Baldwin Wallace University here in Cleveland, Ohio. Let's zoom in on that second stage. That, again, as you had explained earlier, is when we still tend to be selfish, but we are trying not to be. We have an awareness. Maybe our friends have identified that says you're a selfish person, and we're saying, gee, okay, I want to move out of that. I am now cognizant of when I act selfishly and when I act in an altruistic manner, but I still tend to be more on the selfish side. Is that a correct assessment of what that second stage is, Professor?
Yes, that would be a correct assessment, where you're conscious of your selfishness, which means that you're uncomfortable with it at some level. You see yourself still succumbing to your selfish impulses, but you are conscious of it. So you continue to be selfish, but you're aware of it. Yes.
Okay. So where does, we had a little off-air conversation about happiness, how that fits in. At that second stage, does the fact that, do we start noticing that we're happier when we are unselfish? Does that come into play at all? Or do we actually still think at that point that we're happier when we are selfish because we're getting things the way that we want them, and we are acting in a way that benefits us, and in our mind that's making us happier, even if it kind of isn't that way in our soul? Where does happiness fit in at that level?
In many different ways, because one way of looking at it is that the condition of selfishness itself is a reaction to a deeper unhappiness. There is something that we are unhappy with in our lives, and we respond to that unhappiness by becoming excessively selfish. So, in fact, one of the related themes I want to explore for a bit is the idea of stuckness. I mean, if we do embrace, even as a construct, the idea that people can move through stages and have different levels of awakenings and have a quantum leap into an unconsciously altruistic state, the question remains, why do we sometimes remain stuck at different levels? I mean, and I want to draw upon the other pyramid that we are all aware of, the Maslow's hierarchy of motives, where he talks about, we move from one level to another level until we end up at the apex level of self-actualization. And the reason we sometimes are stuck at a level is because we may have unmet needs that we are trying to medicate. So, for example, think about greed and selfishness that are kind of related. When do people stay stuck at the level of greed? Often, if you've had a experience in life that has left you feeling highly inadequate and insecure. And this is fascinating to me because this is one of those points on which Western psychology and Eastern mysticism seems to agree. For example, the Viennese psychiatrist Alfred Adler explored this question very deeply. And he believed that if you have an extremely accentuated or heightened feeling of inadequacy or inferiority in childhood, you try to compensate for it in neurotic ways. And the way you try to compensate for it is by becoming excessively something that you felt was lacking. So, for example, if you felt you were poor, you might be left with that sense of being poor, and you compensate for it by trying to be excessively rich. And sometimes the level of trauma or injury that you have suffered from your own inferiority complex could be so deep that no amount of assurance from the external environment that you're okay ever suffices. So the person obsessively keeps accumulating wealth in a desperate attempt to convince themselves that they're okay. So in some ways, selfishness is inextricably intertwined with a pervasive sense of inadequacy or inferiority, and the desire to compensate for that inferiority. And for most people, if we haven't been so impaired, we satisfy a need, and then that no longer runs our life. So, for example, if you felt you were lacking in, let's say, smartness, you're not smart enough, you didn't do well in school, and, for most of us, we get an education, and that is enough to reverse or medicate that sense of inadequacy. But where the inferiority complex is very deep, it becomes a bottomless hole. Think about all those actors and actresses from Hollywood who you think of as very beautiful, but they think of themselves as ugly. Think of all the millionaires and billionaires who are still kind of stuck in a sense of scarcity. So it doesn't matter how much money they make, they will continue to argue. I once saw a millionaire from Cleveland, multimillionaire from Cleveland, get into an argument at the Cavs arena with the parking lot attendant over $1. And that argument lasted way into the first quarter of the game. And at the end of it, the parking garage attendant actually said, "Forget about it, sir. I'll pay for it with my own money." And this man walked away happily. So he may be a multimillionaire, but there's the deep sense of inadequacy from his childhood or whatever trauma that he has had that continues to run his life. So I think any discussion of selfishness has to be tied with these kinds of trauma that leave us permanently impaired. And I'm sorry, I may have drifted off the original question to the point that I've taken us into some other land. So if you want to rephrase the question, I'll try to do a job of reconnecting this to that if you feel the need.
No, because it was so interesting where you went with that. And I don't know if it does tie in, but I hope it does, because it's a really interesting branch of the tree that you have walked over. And when I opened up, I used the term something with the phrase that said, ego and selfishness go together. And I really wasn't sure when I said that. I really wasn't sure if that insecurity and the ego and selfishness come together. But with what you just shared, they really are apples from the same tree, aren't they? I mean, if we are insecure, then we do have an ego, and then we tend to be even more selfish in that mode. So those characteristics they do work together. For people that are insecure, they show their ego and they tend to be more selfish. That's kind of what you said there, right?
It doesn't have to be that way. It's almost like not like it's a fait accompli. If you have a breakthrough in consciousness of the kind that Ratanjit constantly invites us to step into, in oneness, if you're standing in oneness, you recognize that it's foolish. It's a failed project from the outset to try to compensate for your weaknesses. But if you haven't evolved to that level of consciousness, primitively, you may try to medicate your inadequacy with more accumulation, with more greed, with more seeking more reassurance, with looking for more love, more of something, because then you are incorrectly convincing yourself that more of something is what you need, and you keep seeking more of whatever it is that you think that you're lacking. I can go autobiographical on you for a moment, if you don't mind here. So when I was riding on the backseat of a car in New Delhi when I was 9, somebody commented that I was very stupid, that I never said a single thing that was smart. And they said, if you look at all other 9-year-olds, these 9-year-olds seem to be saying such intelligent things. And Param, on the other hand, makes no sense at all. I hope he'll be able to graduate high school. Here's an example of something that scarred me in some ways, because as a result of that comment, I ended up accumulating the equivalent of 4 master's degrees and a PhD. Now, looked at in that way is where I fell into the common mistake of thinking I'm adequate, I'm perceived as stupid, so I'm going to go those extra 500 miles and spend the next 30 years of my life acquiring 4 master's degrees and a PhD. And often we fall into these errors. And Adler himself talked about how he talks about that as a neurotic response to an inadequacy. The enlightened response, and this is where Adler will find a common ground with Ratanjit, is what Ratanjit calls oneness. As a Western psychiatrist, he called it social feeling. He said it's awakening to the oneness that we are one human family. And that, he said, is the only real compensation for a sense of inferiority. But of course, he doesn't talk about it in the cosmic terms. I think Ratanjit's delineation of oneness is far deeper. It has cosmic underpinnings to it, whereas Adler talked about it more at a social level of recognizing that we are all in this together and a sense of deeper connection. And he felt that when you awaken towards that, to that feeling, then the inferiority feelings that you have are erased. In much the same way that I would imagine Ratanjit would say that oneness changes everything.
Yeah. Ratanjit, you have been in amazing circles your whole life, been surrounded by very successful business people, elected officials at every magnitude, the president. I mean, you have world leaders you have been influenced by and a part of their lives. What is your personal experience? How can that help us to understand this? Have you seen what Param has just shared with us in terms of a core inferiority that has driven people to want more power, to want more possessions, to want more education? Have you seen some parallels in real life with what has just been discussed here?
So no, I agree with him, because see, Ray, if you are dealing with incomplete information, doesn't matter how brilliant you are, if that incomplete information is what you are dealing with, you are controlling, and you are going to make all these decisions based on that information. And the same thing goes when you are being at your childhood, have been traumatized, that information gets stuck in you. That is incorrect information. See, there is the other side of this coin. Other side of the coin is, I saw a bumper sticker in the back of a car. It says, "God save me from your do-gooders." There are so many people who are trying to make this world better. But as a consequence, we are paying enormous price for it, because their do-gooding or their information based on what is good for you is incorrect. And they are being selfless because they are doing good, but their database is incorrect. So you cannot have the correct data in absence of oneness, right? It's basic, fundamental, and all our education, all our Harvards of the world, all our greatest institutions, when we give them enormous worldly information, which is void of understanding what oneness is, as a consequence, we confuse them completely, and we bring two highly educated people in debates. Look at all the debates happening in the world. Two intelligent people cannot see eye to eye. And that is the drawback of not comprehending the wisdom of oneness. Now, understanding oneness is not the world, this is all world is one and all that. You have to go much deeper into it. And as deep we go into it, we have intrinsic wisdom which comes into us, which is much more complete and much more powerful.
See, you just brought some other points into this conversation. I was thinking that at stage 2, at the second stage, where we're aware when we are selfish, when we become aware of when we are altruistic, and we want to make that conversion, we want to have that upgrade, if you will, to our lives, that we are not doing it all the time because we're kind of fighting the inner battle. We're fighting our mind, and our mind still says, yeah, but this is ultimately so much better for you. And you're going to get so much more out of doing this. So we kind of fight that battle. We want to do it right, but we're still kind of affected by what we've done at that point in our experiences. Now you're bringing up a level that says, even if we are trying to do the right thing, we're probably influenced by inadequate or insufficient data that is directing us to do certain things a certain way based on the knowledge that we are using with our brain. So now there's you've introduced to me another level of this, where even if I'm trying to do the right thing, even if I'm trying to make that advancement, perhaps I don't really have the proper information to be able to make that assessment. Now, maybe it's because I'm unaware of oneness. Okay, that's certainly a valid reason why I don't understand what that whole concept is. So I'm not even considering that data. But even if I'm just using worldly data, your do-gooder's bumper sticker, I mean, there's a lot of people that follow a certain, that they walk as sheep to the slaughter because they are thinking that this is the right way to go. And they truly do think this is the right way to go. They buy into whatever the logic is that's being shared by the leaders of that group, and they become very true to that, whether it's political or religious or any which way. And they truly believe that they've got the right data, but they don't have the right data. So, Padam, let's go back to you on that one. How does, again, am I making sense? Is this become a whole nother element to add to this discussion of what data we're using to try to analyze to move through these stages?
I would completely agree. And I think yours was a very articulate summary of Ratanjit's position in that sense. And I'm in complete agreement with Ratanjit that if we are rooted in a paradigm of, whether a paradigm that has been built out of a feeling of inadequacy, the optical illusion, as he calls it, of separateness, any actions that we take from that position will not really bring redemption to the situation. That one of the challenges is that a world run by a set of do-gooders is actually going to be very destructive. I mean, there are jokes about this. The Indian mystic Osho talked about how somebody had heard an exhortation to do kind gestures, help elderly people cross the road. And the next day they came back and reported being beaten up by an elderly person. And when the teacher examined them, it turned out that they were trying to drag an unwilling elderly person who had no desire or intention to cross the road, forcing them to cross the road. So this kind of exhortations to do good actually become more destructive, because unless they are coming from a space of a deeper experience of oneness, they're likely to inject very narrow understandings of our world, and they're actually likely to bring more selfishness forward. So that is indeed a challenge. I think consciously wanting to do the right thing can probably result in some measurable indicators of altruism, but that's not real altruism. Real altruism has to come from a level of, it's just a natural expression of your goodness. So yes, I would agree that good intentions pave the way to hell, as somebody has said. And I think that's as true of altruism as of anything else.
We have to take another break here, and we've gone a little over. So when we come back, we'll just have a short time to try to put a wrap on this show. I don't think we're going to put a wrap on this topic at all, because I think we're going to have to definitely come back and continue discussing these stages. But we'll try to bring some finality, at least temporarily, to this particular show when we come back on Stress Free Living in just a moment. Stay with us. All right, quick 90 seconds that we'll have here, and then we'll come back. We'll only have about 8 or 9 minutes when we come back. Anybody out there that would like to have a comment or a question?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just wondering that why can't compassion be incorporated right from school level? I sometimes feel that the biggest missing quotient in our education system is this concept of compassion and kindness being introduced to children from young age. So
Good question. Good
yeah.
question. We will definitely bring that up in the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else have a quick thought? Got a few seconds left.
Yeah, really quickly. What I was thinking when he was talking about oneness and people doing, I think, intentional acts and not consciously knowing what those acts are, having the other piece to it that's necessary for that act to be genuine and authentic. I think it's based on something that you talked about oneness, but the oneness, as I was thinking, as it was coming to me kind of intuitively, is the internal oneness. In order to be able to come from a place of understanding and adding value, giving value, and being in a complete oneness consciousness, you must do that first within yourself. So your acts of kindness or whatever they may be, they're not genuine if you don't have a full grasp of the internal process, so that now you can see the mirror reflection of yourself and someone to truly understand what oneness is. Because once we're truly in oneness with self, then it isn't an act of kindness, isn't an act of anything, it's just a being. And it's just some other thoughts that I had about that, but that's kind of what it made me think about.
Excellent point. Brilliant. Thank you.
We are back on Stress Free Living. Ray Samich with you, Ratanjit and Ray, our special guest, Professor Param from Baldwin Wallace University in Cleveland, Ohio, well, you got 4 different master's degrees and a PhD, but organizational behavior is a particular area that he teaches there at Baldwin Wallace. And we have our conversations during our Zoom break. We only have a short time, but one of the questions that came from one of our great guests was the idea of teaching compassion, teaching kindness, teaching empathy in our schools. You, having been a student for so many years and now being a professor for so many years, why don't we teach that more in the schools? We teach reading, writing, arithmetic, and today so many different levels of thought and technology. Do you think that if we started teaching that basic thought process of caring about other people and having true compassion, would that make a difference in people's understanding of these stages of selfishness?
I think it would make an enormous difference. I think our educational system reinforces a destructive kind of competitiveness, and it isn't even a matter of teaching children to be cooperative. I think they have an inborn capacity to be. It's to be awakening that in them. There are 2 views of human nature. One that says that altruism and cooperation, and these are things that have to be taught, that man is originally born in sin and he has to be taught these things. And another view that says that man is actually originally born into a deep awarenesses, and often through life experiences we forget our nature and then become selfish, narrow, petty, competitive, and it has something to be awakened, much like you wipe a mirror to clear the mirror of the dust so that it can reflect in that same way. So I think creating conditions and helping kids awaken to this would be so important. I don't want to get on my soapbox here, but I think unfortunately the discipline of economics is rooted in a very individualistic view of human nature. And I see so much of the collapse of societies that are happening as a result of Western social sciences have a very individualistic view. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but what happens is we have to understand that what we consider knowledge is a product of our culture. If the culture is an individualistic culture, whatever we consider knowledge as a product of that culture is likely to reflect the assumptions of individualistic thinking. And I think Western economics and fields like this have created us into an atomistic society where we are all individuals. Everything, even our credit scores are individual. Everything is individual. And there are very great case studies of how this kind of individualistic thinking, when you try to export it towards a collectivistic culture, actually destroys the very fabric of that culture. Consider, for example, the papers that were published about after the tsunami in Indonesia, where so many of the fishermen had died. The menfolk had passed away because of that massive Asian tsunami. So Western NGOs and organizations went there, giving the communities microcredit loans to start businesses. And there's a very interesting thing that I've observed. These were communities that did not think of themselves as individuals. They thought of themselves as a community. But when the well-meaning, well-intentioned Western NGOs went there and started advancing loans, they held people accountable as individuals. And that was very convincing. That actually was very destructive of their culture, because all of a sudden, the women who were there, who were dealing with all of life's problems as a we, as a collective we, and never thought of themselves as individual atoms, had to suddenly rewire themselves to start dealing with the challenges at an individual level. And that was actually more traumatic to them, because their own experience of living in the community dramatically changed. That's just one example of how, when we export, when one culture exports a certain way of thinking into another culture, it can cause a dramatic damage. I mean, think about metaphorically, I don't know if you saw the movie Gods Must Be Crazy, where in the first 15 minutes, there's a Coca-Cola bottle that is accidentally dropped into the middle of a Bushman community or tribe in Africa by a careless pilot. And the movie focuses on the kind of disruption that the single artifact, a Coca-Cola bottle, causes in that community. The levels of scarcity and destructive competition for owning this coveted object unleashes, and it destroys the very fabric of the community. So I would say that if individualistic thinking, is likely to is the very foundation of our educational system, and that's part of the problem. And I would certainly agree that it is possible to create conditions for a different kind of consciousness to germinate in the educational setting.
So we are so short on time. Ratanjit, only a couple minutes left. What are your thoughts? If we're not totally embracing the oneness, if we don't understand this, can you teach compassion and kindness outside of that pure understanding? Or is it kind of a hopeless procedure to do that, because it really isn't going to be done right unless it's inherent in who we are?
Well, see, Ray, we have to understand that as a human being, we have the capacity to raise way above the animal level, because we have intellectual thinking and all that. But we remain at the animal level. So the purpose of education is not to teach to do good, but to make them understand that they are human, to raise them to a human level. And as a consequence of that, all those good qualities which you are trying to teach them are going to come out of them. You cannot teach them. They are byproduct of who you are. Otherwise, you become an actor. An actor can perform an excellent character in a movie. And later on, at the end, once the movie is done, he goes and does whatever he is or she is. So we are creating actors in this world. And as a consequence, it depends on who pays the higher dues for that act. And then we do that act. We are not converting a human to their fullest potential to be a true human being. And that is what we need to teach them. And our parents and our teachers are not in a position to teach them, because they don't know what they are teaching.
It's a brilliant use of the term acting. This show is called Stress-Free Living. And when we are acting on a day-to-day basis in our lives and trying to do things that we don't really understand why we do them or why we don't do them, but we act a certain way, there's no wonder why we are so filled with stress. How can we on a daily basis act, pretend that we know things, pretend that we do things with our families, with our friends, with our loved ones, with ourselves, when we know that we are purely putting an act on, because we don't understand how we really should be, I want to say thinking, but really knowing, more knowing, because it has to be inside of our spiritual vein, not within our brain. So
that's why we start doing good things when somebody's watching.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. And there is that advancement of that second and third stage of this whole thing that says we're aware, but we're trying to act, but our brain is still in charge. Our brain is still saying this is better to do this than that, and until we become that pure altruism. Wow, what an amazing topic. We have just started it. I know we will need to continue this in future conversations, but I thank very much our special guest, Professor Pradam. Thank you for your insight. To all of our Zoom people that had great insight for us. And of course, Ratanjit, you at the very core. Thank you as always for sharing your wisdom and your love with our audience.
Thank you so much.
And we want to thank you for being on the other sides of your radios, your computer screens, your smartphones, however you are catching this. We appreciate and value you, and we truly hope that we've added value to your life. Remember, we're all playing the same game. We'll talk to you again very soon.